my primary goal with, I guess, this content and any political views that I espouse are to remarry like this liberal worldview with a clear, unwavering moral commitment. And the only way to do that is through left politics. And that's why I support Bernie Sanders for president in 2020, if it wasn't already obvious. And people come up to me and they're like, hey, you're pretty liberal. You have like a college background, college educated. Elizabeth Warren seems like your candidate. Why don't you support Elizabeth Warren? And I tell them, I do. I do support Elizabeth Warren, and there's a little asterisk there in the script because there are very, very clear reasons that I support Bernie Sanders. Far, far. It's not even close. I like Warren as a candidate, and if Bernie didn't exist, I would be very, very passionate about Elizabeth Warren. But Bernie Sanders and his coalition do exist, and it is the most important political movement, I think, of my lifetime. So, I'm going to get into the reasons that Bernie Sanders is a better candidate for president by far. And this is despite the fact that I think Senator Warren is probably close to, in a vacuum, she's probably close to my ideal candidate. Very, very qualified, long time accomplishments profile, a long record of getting things done in the Senate, co-created the CFPB, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and I just like someone who gets corrupt bankers fired. So I really do like Elizabeth Warren. But the reason I support Bernie Sanders is multifold. First off, the things I like about Warren are also her problems as a candidate. Some of them. She presents herself as what you would call a reform technocrat. She is someone who definitely believes that government should be by the qualified elite. That you should have qualified people in charge of government, which sounds great on the surface, and I support it in theory as well. If anything, that bias is confirmed by a bumbling buffoon in the presidency. That's probably good to have qualified people in charge. But this is also an era where power is self-curated, that the people who hold the political power are also the ones deciding who holds the political power. So they're curating the power and then they're delegating it as well. So basically, special interests, corrupting financial influence, these things reign very legally but very corruptly in a very broken system. So people in decision-making circles, they've defined expertise per their own credentials. And this isn't malicious. It's natural to be biased towards systems in which we personally have succeeded and found meaning. I don't imagine that people like Henry Kissinger and Charles Koch consider themselves to be evil people, let alone someone in Washington significantly more removed from moral crimes. I specifically chose those two because they are complicit historically in mass murder and mass exploitation, respectively. But the point is that when everyone in power talks and thinks like you, it's very easy to rationalize your choices, to rationalize your actions. And it stands to reason that you're the one who deserves the power, and that your actions with the power and to get the power are justified. So once you're convinced of your claim, you can justify anything you have to do to keep it. So this is just the natural. This is the natural progression of human corruption. It's not with conspiracy, and oftentimes it's not even with malice. But the only solution to these corrupted power structures is to reestablish accountability via democracy. In our politics, in our economy, and in our social foundations, what we need is leaders to be accountable to the people that they represent. And that's the point of lower levels of government. It needs to be close. Every lower level of government needs to be closer to the people, a more accurate representation of the average person. I agree with a certain level of elitism in certain levels of government, that there are qualifications we should enforce. But those qualifications can also be defined a little more broadly. But when it comes to the lower levels of government, by lower I mean closer to the people, more close representation. The more constituents you have, the higher up in government you are, definitionally. And you see this, you even see this understanding, this kind of pedantry in the way that parliaments are named. In the UK, you have the House of Commons versus the House of Lords. There's a clear designation difference. And the House of Commons is individuals representing smaller constituencies, and the House of Lords is a bunch of appointed aristocrats. But and then you see the same thing in India, where Lok Sabha, which means the People's Assembly, is the more diverse and larger assembly, and then Rajya Sabha is the state assembly. Of course, this is modeled directly after the UK Parliament. So, even in parliamentary nomenclature, you're seeing these designations about there is an element of populism that is designed with an element of, in the case of parliament, it's clear aristocracy and borderline monarchy. But then once you get to the Senate in the U.S., you can maintain that idea of the Commons, of the People's House, and that's what the House of Representatives should be. Representatives has that connotation to it, but it's a little bit more removed. So since that nomenclature gets lost in our parliamentary systems, we forget that that's what the design is. The constituencies are smaller so that people can be more accountable to their reps, or to the people they represent. And somehow we've moved past that, where you're seeing constant career politicians dominate the House floor, and even the people who come from other careers, they don't come from like the average American, right? Each of the 435 members of Congress of the House of Representatives, when I say Congress, is meant to represent a very specific and concentrated walk of American life that is encapsulated in their district. Of course, gerrymandering has kind of changed this, but that notwithstanding. So, this is what's so significant about someone like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, with a very, very real and powerful class struggle in her young adulthood that immediately precedes her election to Congress. That she was a bartender. She worked for minimum wage in the north of Manhattan, up in the Bronx, wherever she worked. Not in affluent neighborhoods. She represents a very, very real American experience, a very gritty and difficult, struggle-filled American experience. And then you have representatives like Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib and Ayanna Pressley, who are career politicians for sure, but they also have incredible working class roots, and that informs the fervor of their advocacy. So that's the kind of beating heart to progressive change you want to see. Not someone like, obviously, you've got a bunch of career politicians who really you don't know them before their entry into politics. So that's kind of where we are right now, right? You've got this right wing that's represented by people like Jim Jordan and Devin Nunes, and to the extent that they were not politicians, they were very, very exploitive, like either business owners or members of extremely problematic academic systems. I encourage you to look into Jim Jordan's past if you haven't. So while Elizabeth Warren works toward many of the positive changes that we seek to see on behalf of the working class, she doesn't nurture the democratic staying power that you see really, really fuel progressive movement in Congress. Bernie does. Bernie absolutely does do that. So Warren's trying to promote herself as the good technocrat. She's a well-wishing elite who would fight for the common folk in any way she can. But what she overestimates is her individual power in a city full of elites who aren't as benevolent as her, or well-meaning as her either. That's literally exactly the same thing. So, synonyms. So the problem with Warren is that without a fierce democratic coalition that crosses racial, gender, class, and academic lines, because a postgraduate degree is not a substitute for the unparalleled diversity of human experience, that there are plenty of ways to build understanding of the world, intelligence, and smarts that don't involve a college diploma or a postgraduate diploma. And also, there are plenty of ways to get a degree and come out being really, really, really stupid. that there's plenty of examples of really stupid people with very, very high academic qualifications. So without that coalition, what kind of looks like it might happen is a repeat of the Obama administration, except without even the progressive grassroots coalition that Obama had. He had that grassroots staying power that won him actually the nomination. And once he, with the help of Organizing for America, got into the White House, on day one he threw it away. And the OFA experiment was done. He didn't take it with him. He didn't continue the experiment. Bernie would continue that experiment. Warren isn't even pretending to cultivate it. And I understand her type. I understand what kind of voter she's trying to appeal to and what kind of voter bloc she's trying to appeal to increase her market share. Market share as in like her voter share in the polls. But Bernie Sanders is committed to the cause of collective democratic action. And he knows that democratic action and overturning every level of government with fierce populist power is the best and might be the only solution to the self-corruption of elite power. And this is the importance of the Not Me, Us movement. I also want to get to another compelling criticism. I also want to get to another compelling criticism of Bernie Sanders and what is considered a strike in favor of Elizabeth Warren, which is that Bernie Sanders has been less effective than Elizabeth Warren of affecting policy change in their respective careers, notwithstanding the validity of these claims. Obviously, Warren has definitely has a more salient track record, at least over the past like 5 or 6 years. But that touches into, I think, a mentality flaw in terms of the way that liberals think about what the presidency does, what it represents, and how we're supposed to look at it. Obviously, there's a baseline of if you're going to be president, you have to have some level of structural competence. And you have to be able to not let the house burn down. But one thing we've learned from Trump is that while his presidency is a disaster and it's causing serious damage to our country, the country still exists. The structure still exists. The structures still exist. And our bureaucracies still exist. Our processes still exist. He has not destroyed anything in terms of the foundations of American democracy yet. Obviously, he has a Supreme Court that is radically reshaped and is going to continue to reshape the landscape of American politics. And I think the changes to our judicial branch are probably the most permanent and damaging that have ever been done. But of course, that's not even an administrative competence issue. That's an ideological issue. Is that we let somebody that radical as Donald Trump and Mitch McConnell to have complete control over who owns the judicial branch. But in terms of qualifications, I think you need a baseline to keep the house going. But beyond that, designing effective policy that's not the primary function of the president. It's a great function. But there are plenty of ways to have playmakers who are able to create, affect, and institute change. The job of a president is to establish and shape discourse. And that's the primary distinction between Warren and Sanders and their pitches, respectively, is that Warren has a plan. Sanders has a vision. And he cares about establishing a real moral narrative. And that's the president's primary function, especially in this era. Drive the narrative, establish a vision, and influence national discourse. When messaging was clear and moral, the country always thrived. One thing Trump does really well is that he shapes national discourse, and he does it to devastating effect. Everything he talks about is wrong and terrible, but because he talks about it, it becomes a focus of attention. And he knows that negative media coverage, or his coalition at least knows that negative media coverage is not going to affect the policies that they institute. So as long as the media is focused on terrible things that they can't change, the attention is off the terrible things that we should be protesting. And so he abuses national discourse to devastating effect. But other presidents have done exactly this to greater goods. So the best example is Roosevelt, who had this incredible all-encompassing vision of social democracy. And that was expressed in spirit and law by the New Deal, the establishment of the FDIC, sweeping financial regulations that combined into the most comprehensive expansion of the middle class, of public accountability for private financial institutions. And all of that policy came from him and his Democratic Party, yes. But it started with a very real vision of what America could be and what America could become. And this was continued by Kennedy when he established senior care Medicare. And that was the beginning of America's left experiment in a national healthcare system. And Medicare went on to become the most successful and effective health insurance provider in the country. But JFK's intent was always to expand Medicare to all Americans. That was crystal clear in his rhetoric. And he said it was never designed to be limited to seniors. It was supposed to begin by guaranteeing affordable coverage to those who needed it most, to prove that it could be done. And that principle was expanded by LBJ, who, shortly after his death, signed into law the creation of Medicaid. And that was passed by the Democratic Party over which JFK had presided. It would be a grave mistake to presume that presidents' effect on national discourse is tethered to their ability to immediately affect policy. What else did JFK talk about? He had a mission statement to put a man on the moon. He didn't have a plan to pay for it. He didn't have a 42-step plan to put a man on, wherever. He said, we're going to put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. And Project Apollo was a consistent and monumental failure through the end of his life and beyond. But his ardent support for the pursuit of space exploration and the ambition with which he presented it to the American people, it inspired not only the eventual success of Apollo 11, but it gave way to multiple generations of scientists, engineers, and inventors who developed technologies like which we could never have imagined. Never, ever, ever. Out of World War II, which already was a technological revolution, to say, hey, what we just did, we could do that from our smartphones in 70 years. You'd laugh me out of the room. The point of this is that ambition has always been the cornerstone of American progress. You don't start by presenting a budget proposal. You start by defining the moral and visionary backbone of the experiment that you're running. In this case, this is the American experiment, where Kennedy and Roosevelt alike said, we have an obligation to create a social safety net for all Americans. And they did that. And they defined the American experiment to something that works to the benefit of all people, not just to the benefit of the rich, to millionaires and billionaires with the money and power to buy financial, economic, and political capital, while continuing to exploit labor using disproportionately accumulated power. And also not just to the benefit of, white, straight, cis men, but to the benefit of everyone. And not just to the benefit of those within our borders or just with a bald eagle on their passports. I'm talking everybody. And that brings me to my next point over why I definitively and explicitly support Bernie Sanders over Elizabeth Warren. It is time to get serious on foreign policy. Moving beyond the basic, simplistic, anti-interventionist rhetoric of, your average libertarian or Tulsi Gabbard supporter, what I care about is a comprehensive doctrine of global solidarity. And we can inject that into existing systems to start actively working against global imperialism and against the global far right. Because not only the US is perpetuating that, but our rivals are too. So even while we work within realistic structures where we have to compete in a global economy, we can start talking about basic moral fiber, about how to treat people in our country and in others in the way that we deal with the world. So it is long past due for us to start undermining global empire in any way we can. And this is only accentuated by the continuing rise and mutual enablement of the global far right. You've got Trump, you've got the alt-right, you've got UKIP, you've got left-leaning experiments that are under attack in the EU, in South America, Likud, and Bolsonaro, and BJP in India, and every tribalist faction in between. We are facing a legitimate domino effect. Except this time we're in an age where, because of the internet, every domino is connected to every other domino via every kind of online network. So what we need is solidarity with social democratic experiments, such as Rojava, such as Lula in Brazil. These are people who are trying to protect the vulnerable from right-wing populism and advocate for solving the issues that actually led to it in the first place. So we have to defeat domestic corporatists who support Bolsonaro while he ravages Brazil's indigenous population and sets fire to our global ecology. I'm looking directly at the Wall Street Journal. It also includes solidarity with Kashmir, which lies between two authoritarian political regimes, north and south. And they're locked in a 70-year-long religious conflict. And we're going to talk about one of those regimes later. But both of those regimes are posturing and escalating toward a war that can preempt climate change as the greatest global disaster facing humanity. If India and Pakistan go to war, that is not going to be a war limited to just them. This is global interconnectivity, and we need to start fighting for what is right. Bernie Sanders is the only candidate by a long shot who embodies such a necessary ideal. And I can absolutely fall in line with Elizabeth Warren on domestic issues, given the right Democratic coalition, but I cannot align on this. Elizabeth Warren represents politics as usual when it comes to foreign policy, and if she has the nomination, I will constantly fight to push her to the left, and I will be very much in support of her on domestic policy. But when it comes to establishing a basic starting doctrine of we care about justice in the world, it's time to get serious, and it's time to elect Bernie Sanders.